Quick disclaimer before you listen. The World's Okayest Medic podcast is an educational and commentary platform produced and recorded by me. What we say on here is not endorsed by any of our employers, and we are not speaking on behalf of our employers. Our commentary is our own. Finally, remember to follow your local protocols.
All right. I was going to do this as the Saturday coffee talk, but in the news business, if you're late to the party, if you're late to getting your message, then everybody has gone past you and you're left behind in the dust. I still am planning on doing a coffee talk on Saturday. I don't exactly know what I'm going to talk about because I'm doing this here, and the plan was to do this on Saturday coffee talk. But if you know me, you know that I am never without something to say. I'm sure something will come up. I'm sure I will think of something. Yes, I sound congested. I am getting over being sick. We really got sick. I mentioned that on the last coffee talk episode. Ashley seems to think that we had the Coxsackie virus. Ashley is one of the smartest people I know. She's a family nurse practitioner. Not that that makes her smart, because she certainly went to NP school with some people that she said were idiots that they pushed through. She will be the first to tell you that she's quite out of the game as far as EMS, ER, critical care, things like that. But when it comes to primary care, she's really, really smart. And she is usually right about things. There has definitely been more than a few times where a family member has been sick, they've gone to the doctor, or they've called my father, the retired neurologist, and asked for input. And Ashley's going, no, this is what's going on. And when all is said and done, it ended up Ashley, who was the only one that was right. But she thinks we had Coxsackie virus because it has lingered forever. There was an outbreak in Washington, D.C., not that we live close to Washington, D.C. Well, I guess considering how big this country is, we do. We live 2 hours from D.C. And we had these like open welts in our mouth, and whatever the virus was just lingered and lingered and lingered. And the kids had this tremendous fatigue, and my son was throwing up. So it's a GI component. I don't know. I don't know jack squat about Coxsackie virus, but Ashley thinks we had it, and she's usually right. Anyway, that's why I sound stuffed up. I am rambling big time. So let's get to the meat and potatoes, and let's talk about these AHA updates. I have an outline that I made last night at work. My brain is not fully turned on because I haven't had my coffee yet. I would say morning coffee, but it's noon now. And let's get right into it. So, a lot of drama, a lot of controversy. There's a fair degree of butthurt. I have some butthurt about the AHA updates. We have been waiting for this for years, really. And they put out this update, and it's like the Apple iPhone updates. Drum roll, please. Brrr, and a bunch of crap. Pennsylvania, take note of this, because these new protocols that are coming out. And I will tell you that if what I am hearing is true, and this is totally unconfirmed, I have no evidence, and I have not heard from anybody in an important position about this. But if what I am being told that the only thing that is changing is the format of the protocols, you're going to have a similar thing to this AHA uproar over getting shit done and blah, blah, blah. But let's get to the AHA update. The AHA updates were like a homely prom date. Nothing to write home about. I've spent the last 36 hours on the computer largely reading these, reading what people are opining, reading blog posts, reading comments on social media, which I normally don't do, but I have been deep diving into the comments. I do find it kind of interesting on this topic. I don't really think that the AHA necessarily did a comprehensive review of the literature. I don't know what they were doing all this time. I think they cherry-picked a fair bit of stuff they wanted to include. I think in other areas they did a half-assed lit search, and I think to things that they didn't want changed or things that they were afraid to get rid of, because that's the way we've always done things, I think that they straight up didn't look at the research. And I will talk about that when we get to the epi part. So I've seen a couple people getting the back of the AHA here, and some of it's right. Some of it I agree with. They're saying this is a lot of drama. This is much ado about nothing. This is the freaking American Heart Association. This is their recommendations for resuscitation. This is not the World's Okayest Medic podcast putting out an opinion. This is not whatever, insert PMID influencer, Instagrammer, doctor putting out their opinion, or medic or nurse, whoever, putting out their opinion. This is the freaking American Heart Association. And with that title comes a lot of gravitas. People are going to listen to them. And not everyone in the medical direction community is like the Maryland medical directors. Those Maryland medical directors who are willing to, and by the way, plug for the Alert Medic Ones podcast with Dr. Chismar, the Maryland State Medical Director. They did a podcast a few months ago where they rolled out the new Maryland protocols and discussed them. I think even if you're not in Maryland, you got to listen to it because it is truly like a good review of literature, a state of the science. And I applaud Maryland for having the cojones to look at the AHA and go, I know you're saying that, but this is behind the times. We're going to walk past this and we're going to try things like the dual sequential defibrillation that we're going to talk a little bit about. So the AHA puts out their recommendations, and what they write speaks volumes. Not everybody is a Maryland medical director and is going to look at the AHA with a critical eye. We all know that there are tons of EMS medical directors who aren't involved. You never see. All they do is they sign your command form or your form that allows you to practice, and they make these blind recommendations. I'm not saying this is all medical directors. I'm saying that this is the bad ones, and there are a good bit of them out there. And they're just going to look at these AHA recommendations and say, well, this is what the AHA recommends, so we're going to do this. I read a comment just before I came on here that said like, hey, this mechanical CPR thing that we're going to get into is all a bunch of drama. The AHA is not saying to not use them. They're just saying that there's not evidence to support their use. This is true. But when the American Heart Association publishes in a red box, mechanical CPR, class 3, no evidence to support use, not recommended, that speaks volumes. That speaks absolute volume. So even though they're not actively saying, hey, don't use these, the fact that they're putting in red, no evidence, not recommended, is freaking massive. So let's get into it. Let's do some rapid fire potpourri, as I have written here in my notes. Keep in mind, I'm not going over absolutely everything that was in this update. I also have not read every piece of literature that exists on resuscitation on the internet. I've read a lot. I've read more than the average medic, I'm willing to bet, but I have not read everything. I really do try to dive into the research and not just read the abstract, and I read the study methods, and I read all of that important stuff because you can't just read the abstract conclusion. But I admit, I have not read everything that there is out there, and it is a fact, this is not an exaggeration, that when it comes to science and medicine, there are more than 1 million journal articles published a year. So I don't want to get an angry message from someone that says, oh, you didn't even include the Omega-2 trial out of New Zealand. Like, oh, come on, man, you're opining on this? So just keep that in mind. Okay, rapid fire potpourri. Just reading off my outline here. Heads up CPR, not recommended. Class 3 evidence, no benefit. I think that the heads up CPR thing has been put to bed. Granted, this is not a topic area that I've been really interested in and that I have read a ton into. By the way, did you know that a fair chunk of the information that was used to debunk heads up CPR had to do with the pitfalls of monitoring end-tidal CO2? Look up the the letter, Heads Up CPR, an over-elevated promise in the journal Resuscitation. I'll add that to the references for the show notes so you can look it up. Very interesting letter. But Heads Up CPR, I think Heads Up CPR is dead. IV over IO. The AHA recommends that if you can get an IV, start an IV rather than doing an IO. But if you can only get an IO is fine. They've been saying this for years, and who cares? And really, who's going to listen to this? I mean, where I am, everybody starts an IO anyway. I hear that from other services. Yeah, I am kind of old school. So if the patient's laying there, they're in cardiac arrest and they've got some honking vein, yeah, I'm going to start an IV. But I do start a shitload of IOs in my cardiac arrest patients. If it's some like big obese patient or if it's some vascular access nightmare, yeah, go right to the IO. But IV over IO, who cares? A fib, a flutter, they say go right to high dose cardioversion. None of this, like, let's start at 50 and work our way up. I am not an electrophysiologist. I am not an interventional cardiologist, but I have always kind of been a go big or go home when it comes to the electricity. So just confirming what I have always thought. Go me. They did provide, I don't know if it's correct or not because I'm not an LVAD surgeon, but they did finally provide sound definitive for the compression thing in LVAD codes. Do the compressions, they say class 1 evidence, so clear benefit. Class 1 evidence for treating obese people the same way as other people. I mean, yeah, duh. Like, oh no, I'm not gonna. I did just mention that if I have a huge patient, I'm not going to start an IV. I'm going to start an IO. But yeah, treat the obese patients the same way you would treat anyone else. Finally, we can get rid of the old half-size CPR boards. The AHA has said they are no better than doing chest compressions on a mattress. They actually did say that. And they said that feedback devices are good and we should be using them. I love the feedback devices. Now, I'm not sponsored by Zoll. I don't get paid by Zoll to say this. I don't get paid by Zoll to say anything. But when we moved from the old monitors that we were using and we moved to the Zoll X series, we had with us all of the feedback device stuff. We don't use that anymore at my service because of cost. My cat is meowing if you can hear him. By the way, if you're watching this on YouTube, you have noticed that I am not in my basement studio. I don't know. It's a sunny day. It's beautiful outside. I have the house to myself because nobody's home. The beautiful look out the windows, and I didn't want to go into my basement, so I just moved my computer, my microphone, and my camera stand up here. So I'm up here with the cat recording. So if you hear him making noise, say hi to Leo. I apologize. But anyway, at my service, we don't use the feedback devices anymore simply because we're not buying them. Not my decision, but feedback devices I think are phenomenal. When we were using them, I was like, this compression feedback is really good. This isn't just a gimmick. This BVM feedback is really good, not just a gimmick. The AHA in this update, which again, I agree with, they are emphasizing not only using end tidal CO2 as the end all be all. End tidal CO2 is incredibly important, but it's not the end all be all. I feel like I've heard somebody say that recently. But if you use end tidal CO2 along with the good feedback devices, I think that's a game changer for directing your resuscitation. So feedback devices are good. The AHA thinks we should use them. I agree with that. So the other morning, I was talking to my chief and I said, what do you think are going to come out in these AHA updates? Because they're coming out today. And he's like, I think the big thing is going to be with ECPR. He's like, I think you're going to see a lot of moving towards and emphasizing ECPR. And I told him, I think you're right. And we were wrong. ECPR kind of got shit on. They don't mention it really at all for adults. They do mention it for infants and children, and it is class 2B evidence, which is kind of low quality evidence. May consider for infants and children with in-hospital cardiac arrest. Shut up, Leo. If ECPR infrastructure is in place and resuscitation is not successful. So if you're coding a kid, they're not getting better, you have the ability to put them on ECMO and do ECPR. You can try it, but class 2B evidence. They did go on to list some research. It showed better survival and neurologic outcomes. And then they mentioned other research that showed no difference in outcomes between ECPR and no ECPR. And they said that there's insufficient evidence to make a recommendation at this time. I would love to talk to an ECMO person. I would love to get their thoughts on this. I have to say, though, that I haven't been skeptical of the medicine as far as ECPR. Not so much with the medicine or the purpose behind ECPR, but my skepticism has been with the because I've done some ECMO transports and I'm familiar with it. I've been in the ICU with ECMO people and I see the huge undertaking and logistical burden that it is. And I may not be an expert, but what I do know for sure is that ECMO is really, really, really expensive. And what is the cost benefit analysis of doing ECPR? I don't know if I've seen a thorough economic assessment of ECPR. Now, I know that sounds terrible, like, oh, listen to this guy. Can you put a price on a human life? But think about it. I don't want to say we can put a price on human life, but do we want to divert? Healthcare is like any other resource. Do we want to take away a finite resource away from where it could be applied more meaningfully and apply it to a place where it's not going to have a good outcome? Like if you have a terminal disease, you're not going to be put on ECMO usually. If you have a terminal disease like a advanced brain tumor, you're not going to get an LVAD. It's just not going to happen. So it's nothing new for healthcare to do a cost benefit analysis as far as rendering care. I don't know what the cost benefit analysis of ECPR would yield, but more to follow. I do agree with the AHA that we need more information. Okay, let's talk about Airways. I was pleased that the way I interpreted it, did I stutter there? The way I interpreted it, and some people agree with me, other people I have seen have other opinions, is that I thought supraglottic airways kind of got shit on. I really think that Minnesota study was I'm not saying it was definitive, amazing science that should just from that one study be practice changing, but where they showed the asphyxial physiology with SGAs compared to endotracheal tubes, I thought that that kind of rocked some foundations, and that was kind of not the beginning of shaky ground for supraglottic airways, but that definitely helped push the notion that maybe supraglottic airways are not the end all be all. So what did the AHA say about Airway? Because we were moving towards for out of hospital cardiac arrest. Oh my God, supraglottic airways for all. They're the greatest thing in the world. Everybody needs to use them. They should be using them first line. You had EMS services taking intubation out of cardiac arrest protocols based on data like namely the PART trial, Airways 2, and then there was the SAVE trial. I don't think the data was very compelling. Out of the survival benefit that you did get with supraglottic over endotracheal airways, I think it was in part, not in Airways 2 or SAVE. I don't have the studies in front of me, but it was like just a couple points difference in survival. Should that necessarily be practice changing? I don't know. There was no benefit in using an endotracheal tube over a supraglottic airway in cardiac arrest. So people jumped on that and they interpreted that as supraglottic airways are better in cardiac arrest, which was not necessarily true because if you actually read those studies, you would see that you could just transpose the two and make the statement that there's no evidence that evidence is insufficient that supraglottic airways are better than endotracheal tubes in cardiac arrest. And that also would have been accurate. So I am glad that the AHA came in and was like, hey, supraglottics are fine. They have their place, but you want to tube them, tube them. So they said that if you work in a system, and this is out of hospital cardiac arrest, if you work in a system with high endotracheal tube intubation success rates, go ahead, intubate them. You want to intubate them, intubate them. You want to put in a supraglottic airway, go ahead and put in a supraglottic airway. They said if you work in a system with low endotracheal intubation success, you should put in a supraglottic rather than try to intubate them. I feel like some really smart EMS podcaster has said that before. They also said if you don't think that endotracheal tube intubation is going to be successful, go right to a supraglottic airway, which kind of is my practice, to be honest with you. All right, let's move on. Let's do vector change and dual sequential defibrillation. I'm going to talk mostly about dual sequential defibrillation. I know that Dr. Peter Antevi posted his heartburn about this, and I don't say that in a sarcastic way. I agree with him. And I know that Josh from Alert Medic 1 clung to a teddy bear and cried himself to sleep after they put out this stuff on dual sequential defibrillation. What did they say? They said prior systematic reviews of low quality evidence have not reported benefit from dual sequential defibrillation for persisting VFib. Dr. Antevi put out that that's actually not true, that there was a randomized control trial that exists by Dr. Chesky, I believe was the name of the primary author, called the Dose VF trial, where they had wild success with dual sequential defibrillation. And Josh and all them at Alert Medic 1 have talked about this on a podcast. Please listen. This is their area to nerd out on this. They're really big on this topic. So if you want to know more about that, go to them because they are the experts in this area. But Dose VF did show hugely better resuscitation and conversion of VFib and survival compared to just standard old defibrillation. The problem is that people are going to say that there were issues with Dose VF. There were some issues. It wasn't a true double-blinded, placebo-controlled, randomized control trial. It was a cluster randomized control trial. Go on Google and look that up if you want to know the differences, but it's not like it was, as Nick Ione put, retrospective garbage. But the study was good. It did have some flaws, though. They stopped the study early because I believe it was the COVID-19 pandemic, and that led to some issues with the population and the sample. So they stopped the study early. And while they enrolled a good bit of patients, the patients who actually received some sort of an outcome in that, then were grouped into one of the groups and received some kind of treatment and outcome. The numbers were relatively low, which, if you want to get into the statistics, if you have low outcome numbers and there was a benefit because of the low outcome numbers, that can yield a falsely high benefit number. So that was one of the criticisms of Dose VF. And those are valid criticisms. And that's not me taking a dump on Dose VF. You've got to do this kind of statistical analysis and look at the limitations and pick things apart with a fine-tooth comb on any study that somebody does. That's what happens in academia. So let's look at some stuff in Dose VF. It did get a little bit complex in the study as far as who got assigned to what group and who in what group got what versus standard defibrillation or vector change or double sequential, dual sequential. But the meat and potatoes, and please, as with everything, go read the study for yourself. Don't just listen to me, is that 135 patients got put into standard defibrillation group. 144 were assigned to vector change, and 125 got assigned to the dual sequential. Dual sequential versus standard old defibrillation had actually more than double survival to discharge rates. 30.4% in the dual group, 13.3% in the standard group. Much better ROSC. And ROSC is not a perfect outcome to look at. It's very important, but we all know that we get tons of ROSC and they end up dying anyway. But dual sequential had much better ROSC, 46.4% versus 26.5%. Much better conversion of VFib, 84% versus 67.7%. Vector change, I'm not going to go into the stats on vector change, but vector change was also much better than just standalone anterior pad placement. But the money in Dose VF was in the dual sequential. And the AHA just looked at that and was like, yeah, we don't recommend it. Okay, let's talk about mechanical CPR. This kind of made my head spin. It was unexpected, though. I expected this to happen. What really made my head spin was the epi thing. But let's talk about mechanical CPR first. Mechanical CPR, yes, to the commenter on social media who said that this was a lot of drama and that the AHA never said not use it. You are right. The AHA did not say not to use it. And they did say that if there are operational concerns, like in the out-of-hospital cardiac arrest environment, you may want to consider using them. So very wishy-washy. But again, I emphasize that if the fucking American Heart Association writes class 3 evidence, no benefit, and refuses, declines, whatever verb you want to use to negatively say we don't endorse the use of mechanical CPR, that is going to speak volumes. So they write individual EMS agencies must weigh the potential benefits of mechanical CPR devices to logistical factors such as transport time, safety of crew, and number of personnel available for chest compressions against potential drawbacks such as interruptions in chest compressions related to application. Okay, somebody from Newcastle County EMS, somebody who I very much like and respect, messaged me with the mechanical CPR devices because where I live here in Newcastle County, Delaware, I don't work here, but I am a taxpayer here, and they are seemingly allergic to mechanical CPR devices in this county. They don't like them. Their medical directors are not a fan of them. If it's changed, please let me know, but I don't think it's changed. And this guy from Newcastle County messaged me and was like, hey, we had a lot of issues with time to application because they carry them on every single BLS ambulance around here. And basically crews, this was not their words, this is my interpretation. Crews were dicking around, taking forever trying to get the devices on people. And that was leading to a pause in compressions. And this is what you see in a lot of the naysayers about mechanical CPR, is that it takes too long to put on. There was one study that is oft cited as a no-go for mechanical CPR devices. It was studied in hospital use of them. And first off, the numbers were entirely skewed. It was like 18,000 manual CPR cases versus like a minor fraction of that with mechanical CPR. So you want to talk about statistical power bias, we can talk about that. But one of the groups, I'll post the study, but the mean application time for the mechanical CPR device at that hospital was like 2.7 minutes. Jesus Christ, what the hell are you doing? 2.7 minutes? And I said on a reel where I looked at the study before, I've pinned it to the top of my Instagram. So if you want to see it, go to my Instagram and look at it. But I was also sick then when I did this reel. Maybe I'm immunocompromised, but like, Jesus Christ, like 2.7 minutes to apply the freaking device. I think that my piano teacher brother and Helen Keller could get a mechanical CPR device on in half that time. And they've never touched one before. And one of them's blind. I think they could get that device on quicker than 2.7 seconds or 2.7 minutes. So of course, if you don't know how to apply the thing, there's going to be a big ass delay in compressions. We use them all the time at my agency. The BLS crews carry them. I don't have them on my medic unit. The BLS crews have them. The BLS crews are good. They got it down to a science. And I was like, they can get that mechanical CPR device on lickety split. So I didn't want to just say this is anecdote and anchoring bias. So not the last code I had, but I would say in the last few months, I timed it. I literally did. I pulled out my iPhone and I timed it to see how long it would take them to put on a mechanical CPR device during a pause in CPR to do a pulse check. Each time, I think I timed it 3 times, it was under 10 seconds that thing was on and thumping. You can get that device on quickly if you train on it. It is great crew resource management. You can get the devices on quickly. And even as Jimmy Apple said in a reel he put yesterday, and he tends to be a naysayer for mechanical CPR, he even said that he doesn't know if he would put things the way that the AHA did, because he said what I have said, that, yeah, there is not a survival benefit with mechanical CPR compared to manual CPR. But there's also not a survival benefit with manual CPR compared to mechanical CPR. If you look at the data and you read the actual studies and you don't just read the 30-second retweet. So they provide just as good compressions as manual CPR, and you can minimize pauses if you know how to apply the device and you're trained in how to use it. Go figure. So the AHA writes, several large randomized control trials demonstrated no improvement in survival with the use of mechanical CPR devices. But they did cite one that said there was less good survival. But they did cite one called the PARAMEDIC trial, reference in the show notes, that found no survival benefit at 30 days and worse neuro outcomes at 30 days and 3 months and 12 months compared to manual CPR. And you think, that's not good for mechanical CPR. That's very bad. And then you look at it, and it was an RCT. It was a cluster, again, not a double-blinded placebo, blah, 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 gold standard, blah, blah, blah. It was a cluster randomized control trial, but it did have a lot of patients in it. And you think, man, randomized control trial, like large patient population, man, this is not good for mechanical CPR devices. And this is why you can't just read the abstract. You can't just read the conclusion. You have to read the actual article. Digging into this PARAMEDIC trial that the AHA singled out when they made the decision, class 3, no benefit for mechanical CPR devices. In this study, 1,652 in the Lucas group, 2,819 in the control group. That's 1,000 plus more patients in the control group, which is 70.64% bigger, 1.7 times bigger than the mechanical CPR device. So whatever statistical analysis you do to filter through that, it's maybe valid in some respects, but it's also problematic. There's going to be bias, and there is going to be statistical power issues and a false benefit with the larger control group size. It's just go to stat class. Also, let's talk about this looking at the neuro outcomes after 30 days, 3 months, and 12 months. They really zeroed in on ROSC, which showed no difference in ROSC between mechanical and manual CPR. And 30-day survival was no different between mechanical and manual CPR. That helps to prove that mechanical CPR is not inferior to manual CPR. But the neuro stuff was alarming, and my guess is that's what the AHA hung their hat on. But problematic AF. They report that they had to zero in on ROSC and survival to discharge and 30-day survival because the follow-up data past survival to discharge, those neuro outcomes at 3 months and 12 months, was sketchy because, quote, data could not be obtained from all hospitals included in the trial because of logistical and governance difficulties. So we had a half-assed set of data. All right. So there's a problem. By the way, they define favorable neurologic outcome using something called CPC scoring. There was only a 2 percentage point difference between manual and mechanical CPR. All right, maybe we'll have my neurologist father come on and opine about that, but I know what he would say. He would go, "Oh, Michael, I don't know. I'd have to read. No, I don't know." But here's what made my fucking head spin around its axis. This comes from the PARAMEDIC trial. All right. This is a direct quote from the limitations. More patients received adrenaline after randomization in the Lucas group than in the control group, which might increase their cardiac instability and impair circulation. So they're saying that the patients who got put on the Lucas device received more epinephrine, and more epinephrine is bad and might have actually made things worse. So that might account for why the patients who were in the Lucas device group might have had worse neurologic outcomes. So they got epi and it might have made them worse, which skewed the result. But which brings me to my next point. We love epi. We're clinging to epi. Epi is class 1 evidence. So let's talk about the epi thing. This made me go nuts. Okay, let's talk about epi. The AHA is still clinging to epi. They just can't let go. Also, the Europeans apparently can't let go of epi. Somebody sent me the European cardiac arrest resuscitation guidelines today, or recommendations, and they still are saying give adrenaline every 3 to 5 minutes. All right. By now, We know that epinephrine in cardiac arrest is associated with more ROSC. It is not arguably meaningful ROSC. There was one study, a Japanese study of traumatic arrest, where they found a little bit of a ROSC bump when epi was given, but they said this is false reassurance because all of their epi patients died. Just because they got ROSC doesn't mean that they are going to survive. It's kind of like, and you see this a lot in the comments, well, if they got to ROSC, that is better than no ROSC, which I argue is not necessarily true. If you go out to your car in winter and you go to start the car and it makes no noise when you turn the key, and then you start turning the key more, and eventually you hear click, 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 yes, you have progress. The car is now making noise. It wasn't making noise, but you know damn well that that engine isn't going to turn over and start. That's kind of how I view ROSC with epi and cardiac arrest. But again, I'm not a resuscitationist. I'm not a cardiologist. I'm not one of these amazing researchers or people on the committee of the American Heart Association. By now, though, we know that while epi is associated with more ROSC, it is associated with worse outcomes. The only thing that epi has really shown that it is good for is fostering a nice vegetable farm, which makes me wonder if like big nursing home is throwing money at the AHA. I'm joking here. But is big nursing home throwing money like, yeah, make those vegetables, like, we got to keep these LTACs full. So better ROSC, but worse outcomes all around. And they say that class 1 recommendation, epi and cardiac arrest. So clear benefit, my God, use epi. And then a class 2A, which is moderate evidence to support it, that it is reasonable to administer epi every 3 to 5 minutes in cardiac arrest. So reading what they actually wrote about epi and then looking at the references, which you have to do when you critically appraise something, it looks like they didn't even want to consider taking epinephrine out. I question whether the discussion was even made or if somebody brought it up and they went like, no, don't even bother bringing it up. Like, no, we're not talking about that. This is the way we've always done things. So we're keeping epi in. And in the references, nowhere do you see mention of any study that looked specifically at epinephrine. They, which tells me that there was a fair amount of cherry picking and then just cutting and pasting your old work on epi and putting it into the new recommendations. So nowhere in the references is any study that looked at epinephrine specifically. Like you can't find the PARAMEDIC 2 trial anywhere in the references. That was a big, really important trial. And you're telling me that the AHA didn't include that in their analysis, or, it wasn't important enough to make it to the list of references that they looked at. So if you look at the references, there are a fair bit of like general, like here are like guidelines of cardiac arrest that we cited. Here's past existing position statements, blah, blah, blah. But as far as references, and I looked at them that look specifically at medications, you don't see one that has the word epinephrine or adrenaline or whatever you want to call it. I don't know what they call it in like Australia or Papua New Guinea. They probably have some stupid name for it. You know how like Tylenol is like paracetamol over there, but no epi in the references. So here's what they looked at. They looked at bicarb, mag, IV calcium, vasopressin, or as my dad would say, vasopressin, glucocorticoids, beta blockers, procainamide, lidocaine, amio. Nowhere do you see anything that looked at epi. So I think they didn't even consider it. They didn't even want to look at the evidence. And they said, fuck whatever evidence is out there. And it is plentiful. I've got a whole list of resources that show that epi is harmful and either harmful or not beneficial in cardiac arrest. And apparently the AHA wanted nothing to do with it. That's what I got about this AHA stuff. Let me know what you think. Thank you for letting me share.